That necklace belongs to my mommy, sir. The small, trembling voice of 4-year-old Lily shattered the quiet of the Moretti estate dining room. Every conversation stopped dead. All eyes swung toward the doorway. A barefoot child stood there. She clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Across the long mahogany table, the Mafia boss, Murphy Moretti, looked down. He looked at the thin gold chain on his fiancée's neck. At first, he assumed it was a child's innocent mistake. Then his gaze caught on a tiny scratch on the oval pendant. It was an exact scratch. He had seen it 1,000 times before. It belonged to Allie, his loyal housekeeper. Allie had served this family for 15 years. She had passed away just 3 weeks ago. Murphy's heart seemed to stop beating. If the little girl was telling the truth, a monstrous secret was hiding in this house. No one moved an inch. The dining room had known heavy silences before. It had stayed silent after bad news from Chicago. It had stayed silent when a name was crossed off a death list. This silence was entirely different. It was the silence of a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Tamasachi sat completely frozen. His glass of red wine was held at a sharp tilt. A single drop clung to the rim. It refused to fall. The younger Nico Fontana had a piece of veal on his fork. The fork was halfway to his mouth. He set the fork down. He did not lower his eyes. He simply did not know where else to put them. Salvatore Garasso was the family lawyer. He was 67 years old. He lowered his steak knife to the linen. He did it with the extreme care of a man defusing a live bomb. His right hand did not tremble. His left hand shook violently. He quietly folded his left hand under the table. Roberto Genovese owned the shipping company. His company pushed half of the Moretti containers through Elizabeth Port. He coughed once into his fist. Then he never coughed again. At the head of the table, Murphy remained still. His right hand rested on the stem of a wine glass. He had not touched that glass all evening. Between his two hands, the entire mass of the Moretti Empire waited for his command. To his right, Claire Romano sat rigidly. Her left hand still held her wine. Her right hand had risen on its own. It now lay flat against the pendant on her collarbone. She pressed it hard. She acted as though covering it could remove it from the room. Her chin was lifted a fraction too high. It was the posture of a woman rehearsing her calm. She had almost remembered the choreography. Not quite. The grandfather clock in the corridor struck 7. 12 small bronze notes echoed. It was the only sound the house was willing to make. Murphy did not look at Claire. He looked straight at the pendant. He noticed something he had missed a moment before. On Allie, the chain had always hung one knuckle lower. The oval pendant on Claire sat a fraction too high. It was not a gift. It was not a purchase. It was stolen. In the servant's doorway, Frankie Bellini stood frozen. He still held the bread tray in his hands. He was 61 years old. 3 generations of his family had served in this house. He was the very man who had lifted Allie's body from the linen closet floor 3 weeks ago. The tray in his hands trembled by 1/4 of an inch. Bread rolls shifted against the silver. Frankie's eyes rose slowly. Murphy Moretti's eyes met his. across the length of the room. Neither man's face changed expression. Frankie gave a small tightening of his jaw. It was invisible to anyone who had not buried the same woman. Murphy returned a single, fractional lowering of his eyelids. Allie's necklace was conferred. Lily took one more step into the room. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold marble. Mr. Buttons was clutched sideways against her chest. One long ear folded down over her arm. She did not look at Murphy. She looked only at Claire. There was no anger in her dark eyes. There was only the serious gaze her mother had used at the kitchen window for 15 years. They were eyes that noticed everything. They were eyes that would never look away. Murphy Moretti had ordered men killed for offenses smaller than that look. This time, he needed the woman wearing the pendant to speak first. He waited in absolute stillness. Claire found her rehearsed smile in a second and a half. It was the wrong length. A truthful smile arrives on its own time. A rehearsed one arrives only when you remember to send it. Murphy had watched 300 men lie to him across 300 tables. He saw the exact moment her jaw released. He saw her eyes soften entirely on command. He did not react at all. He simply logged it in his mind. Leaning toward Lily, she changed her tone. She used a voice pitched 3 notes higher than her normal register. "Sweetheart, this is a gift Uncle Murphy gave me last month. You must be thinking of another necklace your mama had." Her eyes darted to Murphy. It was a reflex rather than a strategy. It was the small, automatic glance of a woman whose lies were always confirmed by her man. Murphy did not confirm. He did not deny. He held her gaze. He held it for the exact length of time it took her smile to begin trembling at the corners. Then he looked back at the pendant. His silence was a specific, lethal weapon. 16 years of rule had taught him how to use silence like a blade. It was never blunt. It was never loud. It was always inserted directly at the joint. Lily shook her head slowly. Her small jaw was firmly set. She was 4 years old. She had been raised by a woman who told her a lie was heavier than a broken cup. "No, Mama gave it to me. She said it was her last keepsake. The lady took it." The word "took" fell into the room. It sounded like a stone dropped into cold water. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift. Roberto Genevieve's eyes flicked toward the double doors. He was measuring the distance to safety. Salvatore Grazzo placed both hands flat on his thighs beneath the table. He did it so no one could see them shake. Claire laughed. It was a short, high sound. It lived half a note above where natural laughter belonged. She turned it toward Murphy like a drowning woman offering a rope. "Murphy, sweetheart, the child is grieving. She doesn't know what she's saying. Please." He did not answer her. He did not look at her. Instead, he moved his hand behind the arm of his chair. He pressed a small brass button hidden on the underside of the table. It was a button he had not pressed in 6 years. He had not touched it since the night a soldier disrespected his mother's memory over dessert. That man had been walked out through a door he never walked back through. 3 seconds passed. The side door opened without a sound. Luca Vitali stepped into the room. No weapon was visible. His jacket was buttoned. His hands were loose at his sides. Every man at the table understood the grim mathematics of that entrance. They did not need to see metal. Murphy spoke to Luca. His voice was barely louder than a guttering candle. "Take our guests to the drawing room. Pour them brandy. Apologize on my behalf." Tomasacci stood up first. Nico Fontana stood second. Salvatore Grazzo needed a small push from the edge of the table to rise. Roberto Genovese forgot his napkin entirely. It stayed folded on his chair like a white flag. No one would ever return for it. None of them looked at Claire. None of them looked at Lily. They passed Luca in a single file line. They moved with the mute gratitude of men allowed to leave a room of execution. They were escaping a decision they did not want to witness. The heavy oak doors closed behind them. The sound was small, but it was final. 5 people remained in the room. Murphy sat at the head of the table. Claire sat to his right. Luca stood beside the closed door. Frankie stood in the servant's doorway. He had finally lowered the bread tray onto the sideboard. Lily remained in the arched doorway. She was still in her bare feet. She still held Mr. Buttons sideways against her chest. Murphy finally spoke again. He did not look at Claire. He looked only at the child. "Sweetheart, come here to me. Would that be all right?" Lily considered him for the length of one small breath. Then she walked forward. Her bare feet crossed the cold marble without hurry. She walked without hesitation. She passed the length of the long mahogany table. She passed the pulled-out chairs of the departed guests. She passed Claire. She did not glance at Claire once. She stopped right at the arm of Murphy's chair. She lifted her free hand. She closed her small fingers around his index finger. She did not squeeze tightly. She simply held on. Murphy looked down at that small hand resting on his own. He had signed multi-million-dollar contracts with this hand. He had loaded lethal weapons with this hand. Just 3 weeks ago, he had signed the release papers for Allie's body with this hand. From the exact moment those small fingers closed around his, the Moretti estate ceased to be a home. It had just become a crime scene. The heavy iron door of the security room clicked shut. The lock engaged with a clean metallic snap. Outside, the estate was entirely silent. Inside, the pale green light of the computer monitors reflected across Luca's face. Murphy Moretti stood behind the primary console. His hands rested flat on the cold steel surface. He did not speak a single word. Luca did not need to be asked. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. He typed in the master encryption code. The primary drive spun up with a low internal hum. "Which date, boss?" Luca asked quietly. "Last month," Murphy answered. "The night of the 18th. The night the rabbit went missing." Luca nodded once. He entered the timestamp. The screen flickered. A black and white grid appeared on the central monitor. It was the hallway of the second-floor east wing. The camera was fixed at the far end of the corridor. Lily's bedroom door was visible in the distance. The wall sconce gave off a dim, flickering glow. Murphy watched the screen with absolute stillness. Luca scrubbed the timeline forward. 11 at night. The corridor remained completely empty. Midnight came and went. The timestamp ticked past 12:20. Nothing moved. Then at precisely 1:13 in the morning, a figure entered the frame. She came from the direction of the main staircase. She walked with deliberate, practiced softness. She wore a dark nightdress. Her hair fell loose down her back. From this angle, her face was partially hidden. Her feet were not bare. She wore soft, padded indoor shoes. She reached Lily's door. A gloved hand emerged from the sleeve. A black leather glove closed around the brass handle. The door turned silently. The figure slipped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Murphy did not blink. He counted the seconds in his head. Luca counted with him in absolute silence. 2 minutes and 43 seconds later, the door opened again. The figure stepped back out into the hallway. One black-gloved hand hung loosely at her side. Something small swung from the other hand. It caught the faint reflection of the wall lamp. A brief, sharp flash of gold. A thin chain. An oval pendant. Luca froze the frame instantly. He hit the zoom command. The old infrared camera was grainy and coarse. The image bloomed with digital noise. The shape, however, was undeniable. It was Allie's necklace. It was swinging from a gloved index finger. Murphy did not lean back. He did not exhale. "Slow it further," Murphy commanded. "Show me her face." Luca tapped a sequence of keys. The video rewound 30 seconds. The figure re-entered the frame from the stairs. This time, Luca adjusted the contrast. He shifted the midtones. He boosted the resolution 4 times over. As the figure passed beneath the wall sconce, the overhead lamp caught her face. It illuminated her features from 3/4 above. The infrared pixels sharpened. The line of the jaw emerged clearly. The narrow spacing between the brows became distinct. The particular curve of the right cheekbone was laid bare. Murphy had stared at that exact cheekbone across 90 breakfast tables. He had watched it catch the morning light in the East Garden. He had watched it turn away from him when she thought he wasn't looking. It was Claire. Lucas sat back in his office chair. The room was heavy with the weight of unsaid things. For 30 seconds, neither man spoke. They simply stared at the frozen frame on the monitor. The face of the woman who shared his bed was burned into the green screen. Murphy finally broke the silence. His voice was terrifyingly level. "That is one night. I need all of them." Luca pulled up the deeper archive. The primary system only stored 30 rolling days. But Murphy had installed a secondary measure years ago. An automatic weekly backup to an off-site server in Newark. A server no one else in the entire household knew existed. Luca unlocked the secondary partition. A folder tree opened on the right-hand monitor. 4 full weeks of East Wing footage were revealed. Luca set the software to isolate any motion event in that specific corridor between midnight and 5 in the morning. The results populated in under 20 seconds. Beyond the night they had just watched, there were 3 others. In each of the 3 recordings, it was the same figure. The same dark night dress. The same soft indoor shoes. The same black leather glove on the door handle. Each visit was brief, always under 4 minutes. She entered. She checked. She left. She had been rehearsing. She was verifying the location of the box on the bedside table. She was confirming the child slept soundly. She was measuring the exact distance from the door to the drawer. She had performed the actual theft on the 4th attempt. She had moved with the arrogant confidence of someone who thought she owned the house. Murphy felt no anger at that moment. Anger was too loud. Anger was a waste of thermal energy. His mind crystallized into something colder, something far sharper. "Check the pantry," Murphy said. Luca switched camera feeds. The The service corridor outside the kitchen appeared on the screen. The camera was trained directly on the pantry door. "When did Allie take her morning medication?" Murphy asked. "Every day at 5:30, Luca replied. Without fail, 15 years of the exact same routine. She sat at the kitchen table for coffee. Her back was turned to the pantry door." Luca filtered the footage for the 4 weeks preceding Allie's death. He targeted the 5:30 to 6 window. The pantry door opened 7 times during that window. 4 times it was Frankie coming in for olive oil. The other 3 times were not Frankie. It was the same dark silhouette. It was Claire. 3 visits during the precise morning window. While Allie sat 30 feet away drinking coffee, suspecting nothing. The camera recorded the door opening. It recorded her passing through. It could not record which hand lifted a specific bottle from the shelf. For that, Murphy needed the physical evidence itself. "Pull up the live feed of the library," Murphy ordered. The upper left panel shifted. Inside the library, little Lily was still sitting in the brown leather chair. Frankie had drawn a small footstool close. The old man was folding a white linen napkin into the shape of a crane. His fingers trembled slightly. 61 years of service, but his hands did not miss a single fold. Lily watched him with her mother's serious dark eyes. When the paper crane was finished, she took it with both hands. She set it carefully in her lap beside her stuffed rabbit. Murphy watched the monitor for a long time. He had never wanted a child. His father had died in a hail of bullets on Roosevelt Avenue. At his father's funeral, Murphy had made a vow. The Moretti bloodline would end with him. He would never introduce a target into a world built on blood. He would never put a small version of his own face into the line of fire. Yet watching a 4-year-old girl handle a paper crane with the solemn respect of a priest, something shifted. Allie had trusted him with her daughter, not with words. She had left no letter. She had no time. She had lived 15 years under his roof because she believed his walls were safe. She believed her child could grow up shielded from the violence outside. She had been catastrophically wrong. And Murphy Moretti would never allow anyone to be wrong twice under his roof. "Export everything," Murphy told Luca. 3 copies. 1 for me, 1 for you, 1 in Frankie's safe. Luca nodded once. He inserted a clean flash drive into the console. The transfer began. While the data bars filled the screen, Murphy turned away. He walked the 4 short paces to the opposite wall. A bank of monitors glowed in the dark room. Each screen mapped a different corner of the sprawling estate. The perimeter was locked. The internal guards were in position. The trap was fully baited. Claire was still sitting in the dining room waiting for her executioner. And somewhere in the dark, the external forces were beginning to stir. Vincent Duca had not stopped at a single stolen necklace. A stolen necklace was only the trigger. The deeper mechanism was financial. It was a systematic attempt to bleed the Moretti shipping empire dry from the inside out. And Claire was the scalpel. Murphy reached out and tapped the glass of the monitor. His reflection stared back at him. Cold. Unflinching. Absolute. "Let's go," Murphy said. "It's time to visit the kitchen." The service corridor was dead quiet. The air smelled of old dust and faded disinfectant. Murphy Moretti walked with deliberate steps. His soft leather house slippers made no sound on the stone floor. Luca followed 2 paces behind him. His eyes scanned the shadows of the arched stone ceiling. They were heading toward the small utility room. It was the room where Allie had lived for 15 years. A tiny, windowless space tucked beneath the grand staircase. A space where a loyal life had been quietly contained. Murphy reached out. His gloved hand pushed the wooden door open. The hinges did not squeak. Frankie oiled them every Monday. The room remained exactly as Allie had left it 3 weeks ago. A narrow cot with a woolen blanket folded square. A small wooden table beneath a single copper lamp. A chipped ceramic teacup, sitting beside a brown plastic pharmacy bottle. Murphy walked to the table. He did not touch anything with his bare hands. He drew a clean pair of latex gloves from his coat pocket and snapped them onto his fingers. He picked up the small brown bottle. The label faced outward, printed in neat block letters by the local pharmacy. Ferrous sulfate, 325 milligrams. R. Men. DAS. 1 tablet daily with food. Murphy inspected the lower right corner. He saw it immediately. A faint, puckered crescent. The adhesives had been carefully lifted once. Then it had been pressed back down with meticulous care. Not clumsy work. Precise work. Slightly imperfect. The label had been peeled away, a different compound inserted, and the seal restored. "Look at the edge, Luca," Murphy said softly. Luca stepped closer. He bent his head down to inspect the plastic seam. "Someone peeled it," Luca muttered. "Someone who knew exactly what she took. Every morning at 5:30. Murphy did not answer with words. He uncapped the bottle. 3 reddish-brown tablets rolled out onto his gloved palm. They looked like standard iron supplements. They had the correct oval shape. They had the correct dark earth tone. Murphy tipped one tablet between his thumb and forefinger. He turned it under the cold glare of the copper lamp. He found it near the midline. A hair-thin, horizontal seam, almost invisible to the naked eye. Only an optician or a pharmacologist would catch it. Standard iron supplements were solid, compressed pellets. They possessed no seams. What sat in Murphy's palm was a 2-part gelatin capsule. It had been packed with a foreign substance. Then it had been reformed inside a compressed shell dyed to match ferrous sulfate. It required specialized equipment. It required a proper pill press. It required access to medical-grade poisons and matching dyes. "Call Vito," Murphy commanded. Luca pulled out his encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a 3-digit extension. He spoke 2 words into the receiver. "Ring the case, now." 7 minutes later, Vito Caligari stepped into the utility room. He was 58 years old. He had silver at his temples. He wore a heavy black cardigan thrown over his silk pajamas. His eyes were still heavy with sleep. His hands, however, were wide awake. He carried his battered brown leather physician's case. It was the same case that had belonged to his father. It was a case that had entered the Moretti estate in eras of blood and fire. Vito did not ask questions. He looked at the open bottle on the wooden table. He set his case down on the narrow cot. He snapped on his own nitrile gloves without a word. "This is the bottle Allie took from every morning," Murphy said. "The label says iron. I need to know what is actually inside. As fast as humanly possible." Vito nodded once. He reached into his leather case. He drew out a small stainless steel tray. He took a pair of surgical tweezers. He lifted one reddish-brown tablet from Murphy's palm and placed it onto the tray. Then he pulled out a small flat silver spoon. With the heavy back of the spoon, Vito pressed down. The tablet cracked. It crumbled into a fine, reddish-brown powder. Vito opened an internal compartment of his case. He withdrew a dark glass dropper bottle. He pulled out a single drop of clear reagent liquid. He hovered the dropper over the crushed powder. "Watch the color shift," Vito murmured. He released the drop. The clear liquid hit the powder. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The reddish-brown dust darkened violently. It shifted through a bruised crimson. Then it deepened into an absolute pitch-dark purple. Vito froze. The sleep vanished from his eyes entirely. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. "This is not iron, boss," Vito said. His voice was terrifyingly flat. "What is it?" Murphy asked. "Warfarin," Vito replied. "High-dose sodium warfarin. Ground fine and repackaged inside a fake iron shell." Murphy stared at the purple stain on the steel tray. The pieces clicked together in his mind with the deafening crash of falling steel. For 3 weeks, the Moretti estate had mourned a natural death. The death certificate had been signed by a trusted family doctor. The parish priest had offered holy water and prayers. Murphy had chosen the mahogany coffin. Frankie had arranged the white lilies. Every single one of them had been lied to. Allie Mendez had not suffered a spontaneous stroke. She had been systematically poisoned day after day, week after week, while she stood at the kitchen window pouring coffee and watching the morning mist. "How long?" Murphy asked. His voice was a lethal whisper. "At that dosage," Vito answered, his hands steady on the tray. "Taken daily by a woman of her age and baseline blood pressure. Symptoms begin around the 10th day. Dizziness, chronic headaches, unexplained bruising. A hemorrhagic stroke inside 4 to 6 weeks is standard. If she had the slightest underlying vascular weakness, a tiny, unruptured aneurysm no doctor ever caught, it happens even faster." Murphy closed his eyes. He remembered Frankie's words at the cemetery parking lot. "Boss, she complained of headaches for 6 weeks. I saw it and I did nothing." It all matched. It was an execution disguised as biology. It was a murder designed to look like an act of God. And Claire had used Allie as a testing ground, eliminating a loyal servant because Allie accidentally stumbled upon a digital ledger of illicit wire transfers. Murphy stopped walking. He turned to Luca. "Is Claire still in the storage cellar?" "Locked and secured," Luca confirmed. "Frankie holds the key. No one goes in. She has had hours to sit in the dark and think about what is coming." "That is good," Murphy said, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Because thinking in the dark is the prelude to breaking. Get the car ready. We are not waiting for morning. We are going to finish this." Luca gave a crisp military nod. He turned on his heel and strode toward the elevator. Murphy remained in the corridor for one more moment. He reached into his heavy overcoat. His fingers brushed against the soft, mended ear of Mr. Buttons, the small stuffed rabbit Lily had handed him before he left for the Red Hook docks. He pulled his hand out, balled it into a hard fist, and let it drop back to his side. The hunt was no longer about a stolen necklace. It was about a war that had crossed the threshold of his home. The heavy iron door of the storage cellar swung open. The damp air of the underground vault rushed outward. It smelled of cold stone and forgotten vintage wine. Claire Romano sat on the edge of the narrow iron cot. Her wine-red evening dress was rumpled. Her hair was no longer neatly pinned. She looked up as Murphy Moretti stepped into the room. He did not bring guards. He did not bring weapons. He brought only absolute, suffocating silence. Murphy walked to the wooden chair in the center of the room. He turned it around and sat down backward. His forearms rested on the wooden backrest. His dark eyes locked onto Claire's face. "You look tired, Claire," Murphy said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the calm before an unyielding storm. Claire swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. She tried to summon the rehearsed arrogance that had protected her for 3 months. It would not come. "I don't know what you are talking about, Murphy," she whispered. Her voice shook on the edges. "The cameras in the East Wing don't lie," Murphy replied smoothly. "Neither does the brown plastic bottle from Allie's pantry." Claire's pupils dilated instantly. The color drained from her cheeks entirely. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. "Vito examined the contents of that bottle 40 minutes ago," Murphy continued. "It wasn't iron. It was high-dose sodium warfarin. You poisoned a woman who washed your clothes and cleaned your rooms. You murdered her slowly over 6 weeks. Not because she was a threat, but because she accidentally touched your laptop trackpad and saw what was on the screen." Claire clutched the edges of the iron cot. Her knuckles turned pure white. The last remnants of her composure shattered like thin glass. "She saw the wire transfers," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "She saw the accounts in Cyprus and Malta. If I hadn't done it, Vincent would have killed me instead." Murphy did not blink. "Vincent Duca?" It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation he had already calculated. "Yes," Claire sobbed, tears finally breaking free down her cheeks. "My father owed money to Vincent's syndicate. Vincent cleared the debt in exchange for me. He wanted me inside your house. At first, it was just information. Just ledgers, shipping schedules, and Chicago departure dates. Then Allie walked into my room while I was away. She saw the transfer files on the screen for 8 seconds. I told Vincent. He sent the poison 2 days later from Astoria. He told me it was the only way to secure my position." Murphy listened with horrifying detachment. Every piece of the puzzle fell into its exact slot. The shipping delays in Elizabethport, the container leaks in July, the Cold War that had suddenly turned taut inside his own fortress. It was never just an internal betrayal. It was a coordinated corporate and criminal assassination. "How do you contact him?" Murphy asked. "A burner phone," Claire choked out. "Rotated after 3 weeks. Where is it?" The floodlight above the east gate suddenly died. The power to the eastern perimeter had been deliberately severed. The trap was wide open. Murphy Moretti stood before the multi-panel monitor. His face was illuminated by the cold, pale glow of the infrared feeds. He did not blink. He did not move a muscle. He had expected this move from the very second Claire spoke Vincent's name. A cornered wolf always strikes at the throat. 3:58. 2 black SUVs rolled quietly along the private service road of the neighboring estate. They stopped 200 meters short of the east gate. 6 figures stepped out into the pre-dawn mist. No car doors slammed. No overhead lights flickered. They moved as one cohesive, silent unit. They wore dark tactical jackets and night vision optics. They carried suppressed firearms. They crossed the open ground on foot, maintaining a loose, professional column. They used a folding ladder to scale the low stone wall at the edge of the kitchen garden. They believed the east gate was entirely unmanned after midnight. It was information Claire had smuggled out 3 months ago. Vincent had never bothered to verify if things had changed. That fatal assumption was going to cost them their lives. 4 in the morning, the first mercenary placed his boot onto the soil of the raised garden bed. On the east wing roof, a Moretti sharpshooter squeezed the trigger. The first man dropped instantly, without a sound. His body pitched forward across a row of late-season tomato steaks. The second man was still halfway up the aluminum ladder when the second round found him. He never even raised his weapon. The 4 surviving mercenaries realized the truth in less than 4 seconds. They had walked straight into a kill zone. They split instantly. 2 bolted toward the east wing service door. 2 turned backward in a desperate bid to scale the wall and escape. None of them reached their destinations. The heavy oak service door swung open from the inside. Marco Ferraro and 3 elite guards stepped out. Their weapons were already leveled at chest height. They opened fire in unison. The 2 runners collapsed before they realized the door had been unlocked for them all along. The remaining 2 men trying to scale the perimeter wall dropped inside another 2 seconds, hit clean by the rooftop marksman. 6 men, 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Not a single shout penetrated the thick stone walls of the main house. The master alarm system remains silent. 3 floors up, 4-year-old Lily continued to sleep soundly behind a steel door. In the security room, Murphy watched the infrared feeds without a single change in his expression. He felt no triumph. He felt only the cold satisfaction of geometry. Every action had an equal and opposite termination. Luca walked down to clear the courtyard himself. 4 of the 6 intruders were dead where they fell. Of the 2 who collapsed near the service door, 1 was bleeding out fast from a fatal chest wound. The other had taken a clean round through the shoulder. He was conscious, alert, and painfully aware of where he was. This was the specimen Murphy needed. Bring him to the old wine cellar, Luca ordered the guards. Strip his vest. Stitch the shoulder tight enough to keep him talking, but not tight enough to make him comfortable. 10 minutes later, Murphy descended into the cold, vaulted stone cellar. The prisoner sat propped against a damp granite pillar. His tactical shirt was dark with fresh blood around his right shoulder. His eyes flicked up as Murphy stepped into the dim amber light. Murphy did not stand close. He stopped 4 paces away, his hands buried deep inside his overcoat pockets. "You know whose house this is," Mercer said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. The wounded man swallowed hard, pressing his back harder against the stone. "Anthony Sabatini," the man wheezed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Union City crew. Anthony gave you a name," Murphy noted. "Now I need a schedule. Vincent Duca's schedule." Sabatini stared at Murphy's unblinking eyes. He knew the calculus of survival in the New York underworld. He knew that loyalty to a dead man was the most expensive luxury on earth. He He doesn't stay at the Astoria house anymore, Sabatini stammered. After the message tonight, he moved his base. Where? Murphy pressed, taking half a step closer. The Red Hook warehouse. Warehouse 23. He's got 18 men barricaded inside. He thinks he can hold out until tomorrow night. Murphy nodded once. The puzzle was finally complete. Thank you, Anthony, Murphy said softly. He turned to Luca. Put him in a car. Take him across the county line and drop him at a hospital. He gave us what we needed. Luca signaled 2 guards to lift a wounded mercenary. Murphy walked back up the stone steps toward the main floor. The sky outside the high, narrow windows was turning the color of wet slate. Dawn was breaking over New York Harbor. The final chapter of the war had already begun. The cold floor of the old wine cellar was damp. The air tasted of limestone and spilled vintage. Anthony Sabatini sat against the heavy granite pillar. His breath rattled in his chest. The makeshift bandage on his right shoulder was soaked through with fresh blood. He did not look at the blood. He looked only up at Murphy Moretti. Murphy stood above him with absolute stillness. His heavy overcoat was unbuttoned at the top. His hands remained relaxed inside his pockets. You have 6 names left, Anthony, Murphy said. His voice was like winter water over smooth stones. The accountant in Bay Ridge, the shift foreman at the Newark terminal, and the 2 brokers in Midtown. Sabatini swallowed hard. His dry tongue clicked against the roof of his mouth. He knew he was dead if he lied. He knew he was dead if he spoke too slowly. They aren't just brokers, boss, Sabatini whispered, his voice trembling. Vincent didn't just buy information. He bought a seat at the board. Murphy did not blink. Who? Sabatini whispered, his voice trembling. Vincent didn't just buy information. He bought a seat at the board. Murphy did not blink. Who? Salvatore? Sabatini breathed the name out like poison. The family lawyer. 67 years old. He's been clearing Vincent's paper trails for 4 years. A cold silence dropped into the cellar. It was a silence heavier than the stone vaults above them. Salvatore Grasso. The man who had lowered his steak knife with trembling hands during the dinner party. The man who had folded his left hand under the table so no one would see it shake. He wasn't shaking from fear. He was shaking from the absolute panic of a traitor whose countdown had just expired. Murphy closed his eyes for a single heartbeat. When he opened them, the last trace of human warmth had vanished from his gaze. Thank you, Anthony, Murphy said quietly. He turned his back on the prisoner. He walked out of the wine cellar. Luca was waiting at the heavy iron door. Did he give you the lawyer? Luca asked. Every single routing number, Murphy replied. Lock Salvatore in the Upper East guest room. No phone. No visitors. When we return from Red Hook, we will deal with him. And the rest of the network? Luca pressed. We don't wait for Wednesday, Murphy said. We don't give Vincent 24 hours to harden his perimeter. We move now. Luca's eyes flashed with fierce approval. How many men? All of them. Every car, every gun, every capos. If Vincent wants a war inside his own docks, we will give him a massacre. Within 40 minutes, the courtyard of the Moretti estate transformed into an assembly ground. 12 black sedans idled in a precise tactical formation. 42 hardened men stood in absolute silence beside their vehicles. No cigarettes, no murmurs, no wasted motion. They were veterans of a dozen harbor wars. They knew the geography of every pier, every container stack, and every escape route from Brooklyn to Queens. Murphy walked down the grand stone staircase. He paused for a fraction of a second at the second-floor landing. He looked down the corridor toward the panic room. Behind that 15-centimeter steel door, 4-year-old Lily was still sleeping. She was resting safely with a paper crane on her lap and an old stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Murphy did not knock on the door. He did not need to wake her. He simply turned away and walked out into the courtyard. He climbed into the rear seat of the lead vehicle. Lucas slid behind the steering wheel. The gear shift clicked into place. The convoy of 12 black cars rolled forward. The heavy iron gates of the Moretti estate swung open wide. They slipped out into the pre-dawn grayness without a single sound of sirens or flashing lights. The real war had finally begun. The morning chill bit through the leather of the car seats. Murphy rested his right hand on his knee. The silence inside the cabin was total. Every man in the convoy was running a mental checklist. Magazines checked, weapons wiped, radios encrypted on a proprietary frequency. Vincent Duca had built an empire on patience and betrayal. He had waited 3 months to bleed the Moretti shipping lines. He had calculated every customs officer, every container inspector, and every bribed dockworker. He had assumed the house on the hill was soft. He had assumed a mafia boss with a peaceful estate would hesitate to burn his own kingdom to catch a rat. He was wrong. Murphy looked out the window as the Brooklyn street lamps blurred past. The neon signs of closed diners flickered in the gray gloom. The harbor was approaching. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel began to drift through the vents. Red Hook was less than 10 minutes away. Luca kept his eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. "The northern tunnel is our best entry," Luca said, his voice low. Sabatini was right about the layout. Vincent won't post heavy guards in the subterranean conduit because he thinks it's his private escape route. "It won't be an escape route anymore," Murphy replied. "It will be a cul-de-sac." "Understood." Luca tapped the steering wheel twice. The lead car accelerated smoothly, maintaining the exact tactical interval required for an assault column. Behind them, 11 identical black sedans rolled in absolute sync, 42 armed men moving with the precision of a clockwork machine. No hesitation, no quarter. The car turned onto a narrow industrial spur leading toward the waterfront. Warehouse 23 loomed out of the mist like a concrete monolith. The chain-link fence topped with barbed wire caught the dim amber glow of the harbor floodlights. The guard towers at the corners stood dark. The power cut had already done its work. The trap was fully closed. Murphy reached into his pocket. Mr. Buttons. The small stuffed rabbit Lily had handed him before he walked out of the estate. He did not pull it out. He simply let his thumb stroke the mended ear. He remembered the look in the child's dark eyes. "You take him, then you bring him back to me." A promise made in a concrete panic room 3 floors underground. A promise that had to be kept. Murphy's grip on the stuffed toy tightened. The car slowed to a halt 50 meters from the rear service entrance of Warehouse 23. The doors opened simultaneously. 42 men stepped onto the wet asphalt. The final phase had arrived. The industrial fog hung low over the salt flats of Red Hook. The harbor water lapped against the rusted iron pilings with a low, rhythmic thud. Warehouse 23 stood at the very end of Pier 14. Its corrugated steel walls were stained with decades of sea spray and coal dust. A single yellow floodlight burned above the primary loading bay. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and high-octane diesel. Vincent Duca sat behind a scarred wooden desk in the foreman's office on the second floor. He held a glass of amber Kentucky bourbon in his right hand. Ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal rim. His eyes were fixed on the small radio transmitter sitting beside an empty ashtray. The device was silent. It had been silent for 40 minutes. Anthony's team should have reported by now, Carlo said from the dark corner of the room. Carlo was Vincent's primary enforcer. His nose had been broken twice in the docks of Hoboken, and his knuckles looked like gravel. They went in clean, Vincent muttered, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. The Moretti estate is soft at night. Murphy Moretti spends his time playing nursemaid to a dead housekeeper's child. They breached the east gate at 3:58. By 4:10, they were inside the master corridor. By now, the girl is secured, and Claire has been rescued. Carlo shifted his heavy weight from one foot to the other. "Something feels wrong, boss," Carlo growled. "The radio silence is too clean. When professionals hit a target, they check in within 20 seconds of contact. We haven't heard a single click of static." Vincent set his glass down on the wooden desk. The liquid sloshed violently against the sides. "Silence lends success," Vincent snapped, though a cold bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "Murphy is finished. Once we have the girl, the shipping monopoly splits down the middle. We control the Elizabethport terminal. We control the Central Railway spurs. The Moretti name dies in the mud where it started." He stood up from the desk and walked to the dirty wire-reinforced glass window. He looked out over the vast expanse of container stacks stretching toward the dark silhouette of the East River. The docks were dead quiet. Too quiet. 200 meters away, beneath the asphalt of Pier 14, the subterranean storm drain echoed with the sound of muffled footsteps. Murphy Moretti moved through the concrete conduit like a shadow. His heavy leather boots stepped lightly over the damp sludge. Behind him, 42 men walked in absolute disciplined silence. No radios clicked. No metallic gear rattled against belt buckles. They carried suppressed submachine guns and tactical knives. They moved as a single, living organism driven by pure retribution. Luca brought up the rear of the column. His eyes locked on the junction map, illuminated by a tiny red tactical flashlight. 3 minutes to the central maintenance hatch. Luca whispered softly into the encrypted comms channel wired directly into Murphy's left ear. "Understood," Murphy replied without turning around. "Remember the rules. Clear the ground floor first. Secure the exits. Leave Vincent to me." "Copy that, boss," Luca murmured back. The conduit sloped upward, ending in a heavy cast-iron maintenance hatch. The stenciled yellow letters on the underside read, "Exit 23B." Murphy reached up with his gloved hands. He caught the steel rungs of the ladder. He pushed the heavy iron lid upward 1 centimeter. The sea air rushed into the tunnel, cold and sharp with the taste of approaching dawn. He peered through the narrow gap. The interior of Warehouse 23 was dimly lit by suspended industrial lamps. Rows of rusted shipping containers formed a massive labyrinth of steel and shadows. At the far end, near the loading docks, 3 armed guards stood smoking cigarettes and leaning against a stack of wooden crates. They were talking in low tones, laughing about a poker game from the previous night. They had no idea the perimeter had already collapsed. They had no idea they were already breathing their final minutes of air. Murphy pushed the iron hatch all the way back. It swung open with a dry metallic creak that was completely swallowed by the ambient hum of a distant cargo ship's diesel engines. Murphy hoisted himself through the opening. He dropped onto the concrete floor with the silent grace of a predator. Luca followed immediately behind him, landing in a deep tactical crouch. One by one, the 42 men emerged from the underground conduit, fanning out into the shadows of the warehouse with terrifying efficiency. The kill zone was established. Murphy drew his silenced pistol from his shoulder holster. The metal felt cold against his palm. He chucked the slide, fully loaded. One in the chamber. He raised 2 fingers to signal the assault. The 42 men tightened their formation around the central scaffolding. The countdown to the end of Vincent Duca's empire had reached its final seconds. The first guard dropped before his cigarette hit the concrete floor. A suppressed round took him cleanly through the bridge of his nose. He did not make a sound. The second guard reached for his holster. Luca's blade entered beneath his ribs with a dull, wet tear of fabric and muscle. He sagged against the container stack, dead before his knees touched the ground. The third man spun around in sheer panic. A Moretti enforcer stepped from the shadows and fired twice into his chest. 3 guards. 3 seconds. The ground floor of Warehouse 23 belonged entirely to Murphy. "Clear," Luca murmured into his collar mic, his breath pluming in the cold maritime air. "Secure the perimeter doors," Murphy ordered, his voice cutting through the damp air like a razor. "No one leaves. Not a rat. Not a whisper." 42 men moved with terrifying clockwork synchronization across the cavernous lower floor. The heavy steel side exits were chained shut from the outside with thick industrial links. The loading bay shutters were dropped halfway and locked in place with hardened padlocks. The trap had snapped shut with absolute final authority. Upstairs in the foreman's office, Vincent Duca heard a muffled thud echo through the structural beams. He froze with his bourbon glass halfway to his mouth. The amber liquid trembled against the rim. "Carlo," Vincent whispered sharply, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "Check the loading floor." Carlo unholstered his submachine gun with a practiced, metallic click. He pulled the metal door of the office open a crack and peered out into the vast, dim expanse of the warehouse. The floor below was dead empty. The 3 men posted near the container stacks were nowhere to be seen. "They're gone, boss," Carlo said, his voice tightening into a hard knot of panic. "The guards are gone." Vincent slammed his glass down onto the wooden desk. The crystal shattered into a dozen glittering shards, spraying the papers below. "Sound the general alarm," Vincent roared, veins bulging at his temples. Carlo lunged for the red wall-mounted button near the door. He slammed his palm down hard against the plastic casing. Nothing happened. The indicator light remained stubbornly dead. The wires had been severed 15 minutes before they even set foot inside the building. "The power," Carlo breathed, his face turning the color of wet ash. They cut it at the main transformer. The heavy oak door of the office shuddered under a sudden, brutal impact. Wood splintered around the brass lock with a sharp crack. A second heavy kick followed instantly, delivered with merciless precision. The lock sheared completely off its steel screws. The door swung inward with a violent, deafening crash. Murphy Moretti stood in the shattered frame like an executioner stepping through a veil. His heavy overcoat was dusted with fine concrete grit from the underground conduit. His face was carved from dark, unyielding stone. Carlo raised his submachine gun in a desperate, wild arc. He never finished the motion. Murphy's pistol rose and fired in one fluid, unbroken reflex. A single round caught Carlo squarely in the center of his chest. The enforcer spun backward, slamming into the dirty wire glass window before collapsing into a heap on the splintered floorboards. Vincent Duca stumbled back until his spine hit the edge of the scarred wooden desk. His hands were completely empty. Taritegal tajakia fimbonglisi. His syndicate was gone. His empire of dirt and stolen shipments had evaporated in the span of one cold dawn. Murphy, Vincent choked out, forcing his chin up in a final, pathetic display of defiance. You think killing me fixes everything? You think the commission will let a bloodbath and Red Hook go unanswered? Murphy walked slowly into the small office, his boots clicking rhythmically against the ruined floor. The floorboards groaned softly beneath his heavy tread. He stopped 2 paces away from the cornered boss. The commission doesn't exist anymore, Vincent, Murphy said softly, his voice devoid of all human warmth. I called the remaining 3 capos 40 minutes ago. They surrendered their territories before sunrise. You are an orphan of a war you started. Vincent's knees buckled slightly, the gravity of his total defeat finally crushing him. The last trace of color drained from his face, leaving it the gray of wet cement. Claire, Vincent whispered, his lips trembling. She told you everything, didn't she? Every routing number, Murphy replied, raising his weapon until the cold, black barrel rested against the center of Vincent's forehead. Every dollar stolen, every drop of poison measured. Allie was an old woman who raised me when my own father died on the pavement. You killed her because she saw a computer screen for 8 seconds. For that, Vincent, you don't get a trial. You don't get a grave. The hammer of the pistol clicked back with a sharp, final, metallic snap that echoed through the empty room. Tell your friends in hell. The Morettis send their regards. The gunshot shook the dust from the corrugated iron roof of Warehouse 23, ceiling. The exhaust pipes of the lead-black sedan ticked softly in the cold morning air. The harbor mist was beginning to lift off the surface of the East River. Murphy Moretti sat in the back seat. His heavy overcoat was unbuttoned at the neck. His hands rested on his knees, palms up. The adrenaline of the assault had faded, leaving behind the steady, rhythmic pulse of a man who had successfully closed a war. The lawyer is secured in the East Room, boss, Luca said from the front seat, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. And the docks? Murphy asked. Clean, Luca replied. The 3 capos took over the shipping manifests 30 minutes ago. Not a single container will be delayed past noon. Murphy nodded once. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the soft mended fabric of Mr. Button's. The small, stuffed rabbit Lily had handed him before he walked into the dark. He pulled it out into the dim light of the cabin. The mended ear was still slightly damp from the morning sea spray. He looked at it for a long, quiet moment. The car turned through the iron gates of the Moretti estate. The gravel crunched beneath the tires. The grand stone house stood tall against the gray dawn. The lights in the east wing were softly glowing. Murphy stepped out of the car. He walked up the grand stone steps alone. He did not use the elevator. He climbed the stairs one by one, his heavy boots echoing softly through the empty corridor. He reached the second-floor east wing. The reinforced steel door of the panic room stood ajar. Inside, the warm light of a bedside lamp spilled across the wooden floor. Murphy stepped over the threshold. Lily was sitting up in the middle of the large white bed. Her dark eyes were wide and clear. She had her small knees pulled up against her chest. She was holding the paper crane Frankie had folded for her the night before. When she saw Murphy enter, She did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply watched him with the quiet, solemn maturity of a child who had lived through too much silence. Murphy walked to the edge of the bed. He did not kneel. He bent forward slightly and opened his right hand. Resting in his palm was the small, mended rabbit. "I brought him back, Lily," Murphy said. His voice lost all the cold, sharp edges of the harbor. It was softer than it had been in 15 years. Lily looked down at the toy in his hand. She slowly lowered her knees. She reached out with small hands and took Mr. Buttons from his palm. She pressed the stuffed rabbit against her chest, right over her heart. Then she looked up into Murphy's dark eyes. "Did you find my mommy?" she asked. The question hung in the quiet room like a falling leaf. Murphy did not look away. He met her gaze with absolute, unblinking honesty. "Your mother loved you very much, Lily," Murphy said softly, his hand resting gently on the edge of the blanket. "She kept you safe in her heart until her very last breath. And nobody will ever hurt this house again." Lily blinked twice. A single tear spilled before her lower lashes and tracked down her cheek. She did not sob, she just nodded once. She reached out and laid the paper train in Murphy's large, calloused palm. "You can have this," she whispered, "so you don't have to fight anymore." Murphy looked down at the fragile white paper crane in his hand. The paper was slightly creased at the wings. The edges were soft from her small fingers holding it for hours. He closed his hand gently around it. "Thank you, Lily," Murphy said. "I'll keep it safe." He stood up straight. He turned toward the open door. Outside, the first golden rays of the New York sun broke over the eastern horizon. The morning light washed across the stone floors of the estate, driving the last shadows of the long wall into nothingness. Murphy walked out into the corridor and closed the door behind him. The Moretti empire was secure. The blood debt was paid in full. And inside the warm room, a little girl finally went back to sleep. The fate of the East Coast underworld